Thanks for joining us. I'm Randall Bennett. Now that the web has become an integral part of many people's lives, be it work, personal, social, whatever, losing internet access can be something that's very traumatic. And now today, earlier this morning, people had lost access to Google, and while the outage hasn't yet been explained as the time of this recording, it's brought a lot of questions on the front of people's minds about what to do if Google stops working, such a seminal part of the internet. Let's talk about some of our favorite people's backup strategies. We bring in Josh Levinson from CNET. Josh, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We also have Christina Warren from Download Squad. Christina, thanks for being with us as well.
Glad to be here.
So you guys are both web workers. You live and die by the internet, and if the internet stops working for you, whether it be a local cable cut or something more national, it's a big problem because you can't do your livelihood. Josh, are there ways that you go about protecting yourself against an internet outage, or how scared are you if something stops working for your daily work life?
It's a pretty big deal. One of the biggest concerns really when Google goes down is that it's a search engine we all use, and in the case of this outage, it wasn't just the search engine; it's all these other services that are connected to it. And so the big problem is really figuring out if what is actually down and what isn't. And one of the things I use usually is are my sites down or not, or is it down for me or everyone else?
For me, yeah.
And that's usually a good way to check if an undersea cable has been cut, or I just need to reset my router.
Yeah. So with something like this, where you can't get access to Google, are there any steps you've taken in the past, or is this current thing making you think about ways to kind of proof yourself against, say, something like Gmail goes down, or your calendar, or something like that? I mean, are you using lots of different services to kind of protect against this?
Well, I kind of try and leverage all my work out to a slew of different sites, so I'm not depending on one too much. But I think the scary thing in this situation is the people who are, and the people who have been kind of entrusted all their data to Google for businesses, and they can't get at it for hours. That's going to stop everything you're doing.
It's a nightmare. Christina, what about you? So you write for Download Squad. You're a web worker,
right.
And you're in the situation where Josh maybe goes into an office, but you're doing this all from home. Are there things that you do to really protect yourself against that local cable cut, or having your cable service, Time Warner, Comcast, whoever, go out and not have access to the internet? Are there things you're doing to protect yourself?
Yes, no, kind of.
Yeah.
There's only so much I can do as far as from the cable front, because we're limited by what our providers can be. And my experience, although I had an issue with Comcast yesterday and complaining about it on Twitter, significantly helped get the issue resolved. Thank you, team at Comcast, for helping me. I do appreciate it. Comcast rules, I'll say that, despite my tweets from yesterday. If I have to rely on my 3G data connection for my cell phone, that's always a possibility. And of course, the always viable stealing Wi-Fi from the neighbors. If it comes down to it, or I think if it was really, really bad, I would go to Starbucks or something like that and try to work. But there's, short of getting an integrated business line, there's not a whole lot I can do in terms of an actual connection. But services, there's probably more I could be doing.
So with these services, how do you kind of stay productive in, say, your Gmail list? A Gmail is something that I rely on constantly. We use Google Apps at TechV. If you're without Gmail, do you kind of live without it for a couple hours, or is there some backup plan you have just in case?
Well, I've only been using Google to do all of my email for the last 12 months or so, and I use Google Apps for my domain, so I have them handling my mail servers, and that's tended to be a little bit more reliable than some of the actual Gmail outages. So if my local Gmail account is down, I usually can still access my mail accounts. What I'm thinking about doing, since the outages have become a little more frequent, is going back to having a reserve hosted mail account with my web hosting provider, and seeing if that would at least give me some way to access stuff. And it's funny, I originally switched to using Google Apps because my web server mail was not reliable, and figured, okay, well, Google Apps will be more reliable. And it's kind of like, okay, at what point do you roll up your sleeves and run your own mail server, which I think is kind of stupid for most people, or do you have to investigate all sorts of alternatives for backup email hosting? I don't know.
I guess really it comes down to how critical is it for you to have email access at all times. And these Google outages have been pretty rare. It's been a few minutes here or there, whatever like that. Josh, we're putting all of our lives online now. If you look at Facebook or Flickr or Twitter or any of these different web apps, people rely on a service rather than their own computer to store a lot of their own personal information. Do you think that this outage and subsequent outages like this will kind of have people thinking twice about putting all their data in the cloud?
Definitely. Well, the good thing about this is that the data is not lost. It's just it wasn't getting there for a while.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the best case scenario. It's not gone forever, just for now. I think what's really scary is some of these sites that were depending on Google for kind of some of these tertiary services like Google Analytics.
Yeah, that was a
Like
big thing.
the fact that you couldn't actually load a site if it had it loading that strip of code to do the analytics, like that's terrifying as a site owner. And to get it back, you have to get rid of it temporarily. So I think Google's definitely going to take some big steps after this to get it to work again. And for consumers, it has to be about being smart about getting at your data and the tools you're using to get at it.
Yeah.
Get at it. Make sure you have offline copies too. It's important.
One of the other things we want to talk about for a second, switching gears, speaking of web applications, is Twitter. Now, Twitter has had the reputation, for nerds anyway, as a service that's constantly down, constantly unreliable, and they've done a pretty good job at rectifying that situation until yesterday. Yesterday was 24 hours of hell for the guys over Twitter. It started off with a revolt as they switched off a feature which they claimed was part of an engineering problem. It left everyone freaking out about how their streams updated and all these different nerd freakouts anyway. But then to cap it all off yesterday night, Twitter streams stopped updating. So all of a sudden for a few hours, people could send tweets successfully, but they couldn't receive them successfully. Now Twitter's had this problem for a while. Christina, do you think that with this reputation of the fail whale and people not thinking Twitter's reliable, do you think people are going to get fed up? I mean, even just early adopters, regular people, I'm sure aren't going to really miss 2 hours of Twitter, but early adopters seem to be kind of a little bit on edge. Do you see that, or do you think that people are just kind of happy with Twitter regardless?
Well, I think it's one of those things where people, especially early adopters of Twitter, love to complain about Twitter. No, I mean, it's one of those things, love to complain about Twitter, love to, hate on Twitter, but yet at the end of the day, they're still using Twitter. I mean, even if they're using something like FriendFeed, what they're usually doing is pulling in their Twitter stream and, publishing back out to Twitter. So I don't know. I guess it really depends on how much the outages start impacting what people are doing with the service. If it gets to that point, then yeah, you can look at moving on. But if it's, I think the core group of complainers are just people who like to complain about Twitter, and it's going to take a whole lot more for them to actually move on to something else.
So it's almost kind of like a running joke at this point that Twitter is down and people just kind of like to complain. Josh, is that how you see things? Do you see it as kind of like, the vocal minority?
Well, my big beef with their change to replies, along with this, is that that and Facebook, they do these big changes without really asking for permission, and then they kind of roll back on it, and after people are already angry about it. And the thing I don't like is if you're going to make a change, do it, and they don't stick with it. They roll it back.
Yeah.
And if they do want to make a change, then they go out and ask, and it's this long process. But you need to get this solid system where you're always either asking or always doing, and not asking for forgiveness afterwards.
I think it's kind of interesting that maybe Twitter has kind of fallen down a little bit and they're learning from their mistakes, but I think both Twitter and Facebook are both prime examples of once you release a product that's meant for mass consumption, and in the digital age, you really don't own that product by yourself. You're in it with millions of people who are with you, and unfortunately bigger industries like media and things like that, they're finding out through piracy that they don't really, once they put that out there, it's not just theirs. And I think companies like Twitter and Facebook will figure this out hopefully sooner rather than later. Guys, we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Josh Lowenson from CNET, thanks for being with us. You're part of Webware, webware.com for a plug. There you go. Also, Christina Warren from Download Squad, thanks for being with us. Downloadsquad.com, among TWA and a billion other places. So that is it for today's show. I'm Randall Bennett. Catch us on iTunes. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere. See you later.